Hello, sisters and brothers, comrades and friends. Welcome to Live Mike with Mike Pelisek, December 3rd, 2020. We're broadcasting live from the National Capital Region of Soviet Kazakhstan. And joining us this week on the podcast is none other than Dimitri Lascaris. Now, Dimitri came out of almost nowhere to surprise all kinds of people on the left earlier this year, actually 2 months to the day to be exact, when Dimitri was running for leader of the Green Party of Canada on an eco-socialist platform. And he wasn't the only one. There were a handful of candidates that were putting forward an anti-capitalist message and trying to bring that to the Green Party. Dimitri came in second place, managed to get about 42% of the vote, if memory serves me correct. And I think the campaign was somewhat of a surprise for many people in the socialist movement and who pay attention to politics in Canada, that there's clearly this large anti-capitalist, eco-socialist wing of the Green Party that existed, I think, almost unnoticed until this year. But joining us now live on the line from Montreal is Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you from Soviet Quebekistan.
Soviet Kazakhstan, yeah. That's the tagline I'm going with. I believe some right-wing congressman in the States called Canada Soviet Kazakhstan during the Bush administration.
Right.
And I'm just going with it. But
I love it.
welcome to the show, Dimitri.
Pleasure to join you, Mike. Thank you for having me on.
So, quite the campaign. I mean, 2 months to the day. I hope you've had some time to rest up since then.
Well, certainly it hasn't been nearly as demanding as the campaign. I was about 8 months. I probably averaged somewhere in the range of 15 hours a day, and didn't have a day off from February until the end of the campaign on October 3rd. So yeah, I mean, I couldn't have sustained that. It would have killed me if I'd continued working at that pace. But two things have happened since then to keep me pretty busy. One is I have, a legal practice, and I don't practice full time, but the clients that I do have were very patient with me throughout the campaign and, allowed me to defer a lot of work, which piled up and I had to deal with in the last 2 months. But also the Green Party immediately transitioned from the leadership contest into the policy process. Its biannual general meeting is supposed to happen. It was actually supposed to happen on October 3rd when the leadership contest was announced, but it had to be delayed because of the pandemic. So they just went for, they confined that weekend to announcing the winner of the contest, moved the biannual general meeting until next year, and immediately launched the policy process, which is, been very interesting. I and others have put forward quite a progressive slate of policies, eco-socialist policies relating to taxation on the wealthy, relating to military spending, postal savings bank, the Bank of Canada engaging in money creation to fund socially productive initiatives, and on and on. And so we're very excited about these policies, and we're hopeful that we will be able to persuade the members of the party to adopt them. And if we do, I think we'll be far and away, we'll have the most progressive platform in Parliament today by a wide margin. So it's exciting to be involved in that initiative.
So, the Green Party, I mean, I'm a lifelong socialist, and the Green Party isn't exactly what I would think about when I think about a socialist movement in Canada. And yet, your campaign, I think, certainly took me by surprise. I've known you for a while. I've always had respect for the work that you do. You're an outstanding activist. But I have to say, I was surprised when I saw that I was watching the leadership results live to see such a groundswell of support for socialist ideas within the Green Party. Certainly, there must have been all kinds of resistance to this. Can you talk a little bit about how the campaign unfolded and where?
Yeah.
where the support came from.
Yeah, people, on the people on the left shouldn't be too surprised by what happened, because if you actually looked at the platform of the party in the last election and the prior election, it was arguably more progressive in its platform than the NDP. So, we've been championing for a number of years. I'm not being partisan here. I'm actually, I myself have been a member of the NDP. I've had my flirtation with the party, but at the end of the day, when I looked at the Green Party platform, pharmacare, free post-secondary education, a climate plan that is more assertive and respectful of science than that of any party in parliament, and on and on. I mean, we actually had a very plausible argument to make that we were the most progressive party in parliament, but we didn't have an eco-socialist platform. That is true. And there's been a struggle for some time within the Green Party of Canada. This is not new, between its eco-socialist wing and what some people refer to perhaps unflatteringly as the eco-capitalist wing. And, for the past 15 years or so, those within the party who are, fairly progressive in their orientation, but believe that the capitalist system can be reformed and that we can save this planet and have a healthy democracy in a capitalist system, they have, held sway in the party. They've essentially been in control of the party, while at the grassroots level, there has always been a very strong, eco-socialist component. Now, more than 15 years ago, if you go back to the time of Joan Rousseau, who endorsed me, she's a former Green Party leader, and she was a leader back in the late 90s, I think in 2000 as well. Back then, the party was very much an eco-socialist party. So, we've been having the struggle for decades. And I think that really came to the fore in this leadership contest. And it wasn't just the existing eco-socialist, component within the party, which was already very substantial and influential, although we weren't, I think it's fair to say, in control. A lot of people also joined the party. People who were with the NDP, people from the organized labor movement, people who were never really engaged in party politics at all, but who really were attracted to our eco-socialist platform. The party's membership grew from, I think, about 22 or 23,000 to 35,000 people over the course of the campaign. And, we know for sure that a lot of those people, those new members, joined the party in order to support an eco-socialist agenda. So it was partly a reflection of, the fact that we came so close to winning. It was partly a reflection of the existing support within the Green Party for eco-socialism, and it's always been there. But also the fact that we attracted a lot of members to the party.
Now, I've been an NDP supporter for all of my adult life. I've been a member of the party and held various positions in the party at different times. I'm not a member of any political party right now, but the reason I've supported the NDP is, one, because I'm a socialist. I think we need to transcend capitalism, but two, it's not that the NDP has really been calling for that, frankly. But even though their constitution set it up until recently, and they removed it a few years back. But for me, the reason I've been active in the NDP is because of the links to the trade union movement, and I would think that any sort of form of socialist initiative is going to require the active participation of the organized working class, and that's one of the reasons I've always turned towards the NDP, even though I often disagree with what they're actually campaigning on and for. Whereas the Green Party, for me, I come from BC, where they often play a role of sort of splitting the vote and letting the right wing in, or at least that's the perception that we've had. So for me, seeing the Green Party as an axis to advance an anti-capitalist message is unexpected, but I think a welcome surprise. You mentioned lots of former NDPers, and you're a former NDPer yourself. coming on board. What was it like navigating that sort of difference between the two parties?
Well, I was very explicit from day one that this has been, I think there are two main shortcomings with our party over the past 15 years, in what I would call the post Joan Rousseau era. And the one is we have not done nearly enough to protect and advance the rights and interests of working Canadians. In fact, I would say that that's probably our biggest single shortcoming over the past 15 years. And I think it's been the shortcoming that has been the greatest obstacle to dramatic growth in the party. And the other respect in which I think we have not done nearly enough, actually there are three. The second one is wealth concentration in the hands of the few. And I think that is an issue that matters a great deal to working Canadians, and rightly so. Not just the rights of organized labor, safe workplaces and so forth, but also inequality, very important to working Canadians. And the third thing, which is also very important to working Canadians, and if you look at the very progressive stances that unions like Canadian Union of Postal Workers have taken, Unifor have taken on foreign policy, that is another area in which we've been weak. We have not been champions of an anti-imperialist and anti-militarist foreign policy. So I was very outspoken about that from the beginning, and we put forward a workers' rights platform. It was, I think, the first one we rolled out, and that was a conscious decision on our part. And we advocated for things like a $20 minimum wage, a maximum 10-to-1 spread between the highest paid executive and the lowest paid employee in a corporate entity, mandatory representation of workers on the boards of corporations, and on and on. And the renegotiation, and when I say renegotiation, I'm talking real renegotiation of Canada's trade agreements to build into them enforceable mechanisms for the protection of workers' rights. And so within weeks of our rolling out this platform, Sid Ryan, former president of the Ontario Federation of Labor, one of the most outspoken defenders of workers' rights in this country, he endorsed our platform. He endorsed me as a candidate and said that he had not seen a workers' rights platform that was that progressive, that protective of the rights and interests of workers from the NDP, either federally or provincially, in his lifetime. And this is something, if this party wants to grow, that's something it's going to have to do. It is going to have to change the narrative. And the narrative is, that the NDP has historically been the champion of organized labor. It has organic links to the union movement in this country. And that's where, workers in this country should park their vote. We have to change that narrative and do it not through empty rhetoric, but by, putting forward substantive, courageous, bold policies that will really set us apart as the true champion of workers in this country. I cannot stress the importance enough of doing that. And it's not just a question of what's electorally smart. It's primarily a question of what is right, and what is good for the environment. Our party is very concerned about the environment. I actually believe that the best way, or one of the best ways to protect the environment, is to reduce inequality, empower working Canadians to actually determine the fate of the businesses for which they toil and sacrifice every day. Give them a voice in the boardrooms, give them control, democratize the workplace. Then we're going to see real and dramatic progress in terms of resolving the climate emergency.
I really don't see a way to actually solve the problems that climate change presents us with under a market economy. I think it's fairly clear to anyone that takes a serious look at it that capitalism is not going to get us out of this crisis, and so I think it maybe shouldn't be so surprising that the environmental movement, the climate change movement, and the Green Party may be coming to the same conclusions. That at the end of the day, we're destroying the planet for profit, not really for any other reason. We could rearrange society in a way to be in harmony with nature, but that wouldn't be very profitable for a lot of the people who are in lording over our economy right now. That obviously wouldn't be good news for the Jeff Bezoses of the world. And so I think, you mentioned earlier that people referred to I guess the right wing of the party as eco-capitalism. I mean, do you think people are maybe drawing the conclusion that there is no real future for us under eco-capitalism? There's no such thing as eco-capitalism? Is that reflection starting to take a hold in the Green Party, or was this campaign really a whole bunch of socialists joining the party and trying to push it in one direction?
Eco-capitalism is as real as the unicorn, Mike. Okay, it is a mythology. There is no way in hell that we are going to resolve the climate emergency in a capitalist system. The destruction of the planet is baked in to capitalism. Capitalism is about the maximization of profit above all else, and the concentration of wealth in a few hands, and the employment of that wealth to externalize the cost of production and prevent the types of reforms that are necessary in order to preserve our democracy, in order to preserve the planet, in deference to the wealth of and the privileges of the few. That's capitalism in a nutshell. And what I was saying from day one in the campaign, I think this is a big part of this, huge part of the reason why our campaign came so close to winning, that capitalism is the core cause of the climate emergency. And I can't tell you how often longtime Greens who had not heard that message from a leadership candidate were just thrilled and so excited to hear that message, because they knew it in their bones. They have realized, I think the vast majority of the people in this party, and I don't believe they're fully represented at the leadership level just quite yet, but I think the vast majority of people in this party, including a lot of people who didn't vote for me, fundamentally understand that we need to get beyond the capitalist system and dismantle it altogether, create an entirely new economic order in order to have any hope at all of resolving the climate emergency, and also of preserving our democracy, what little remains of it. Not that we ever had a real democracy. We've only ever had a quasi-democracy. But at least we had more of a democracy back in the 60s and 70s when we had more egalitarian society than we do today. Now we have a rump of democracy. So it's not just about environmental protection. It's also about democratic principles and in the preservation of our democratic institutions. We cannot, today I posted on my Twitter feed, I pinned it because it was something that really resonated with me. Last night I watched, somebody recommended to me, I watched the sequel to a documentary that was done some time ago called The Corporation. And the sequel is called The New Corporation. It's even better than the first one. I can't urge you enough to watch it. You can watch it on YouTube and rent it for $5. And in it, the narrator quoted a wonderful statement by United States Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, who was appointed to the Supreme Court back in, I think, 1915, just leading up to that period, where there was extreme wealth in the United States. There was a complete dismantling of any social protections, which culminated in the Great Crash of 1929, followed by the Great Depression. That's when he was put on the Supreme Court, and he served on the Supreme Court. And Justice Brandeis, I think it was absolutely visionary what he said. He said, we can have a society in which wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few, or we can have a democracy, but we can't have both. And that's exactly the choice confronting of us. What we have today is a society in which wealth is concentrated in the hands of the few. Let's not kid ourselves anymore. They call the shots. They control the agenda. And nothing demonstrates that more than the fact that a poll recently came out which showed that a very considerable majority of Canadians, including 64% of people who identify as conservative supporters, support a wealth tax. In the Liberal Party, it was 80%, Mike. 80% support a wealth tax. And the Liberals and the Conservatives in the Bloc voted against the NDP motion for a puny, tiny little 1% wealth tax, which is inadequate in my view. And the Greens, to their credit, the 3 Green MPs supported the NDP in that. But even in the Liberal Party, where 80% say they support a wealth tax, they voted against it. Who's calling the shots? Who's calling the shots? The billionaires are calling the shots. Who are we kidding, man? It's time for us to wake up and smell the roses. And the people in the Green Party have started to do that. And so have the people in the NDP and people in the Liberal base as well. And that's why they started coming over to our campaign, not because of me. They were coming over because what they heard resonates with them. It's the truth that they understand, that they've come to appreciate is at the core of the crises confronting us.
And of course, you weren't the only eco-socialist candidate in the race. There were a number of other people, and it all came together. You ended up on as second place at the end with the support of a number of other people. So can you talk a little bit about how that played out?
Well, there were 8 candidates. There were only, I mean, if you go back further in time, I'm talking about the 8 who actually officially entered the race, because there was a vetting process, and some did not actually get through, or they didn't even attempt to go through the vetting process. So if you look at the 8 candidates, it was 8 or 9 now, I can't remember, it was 8 or 9. There were only 2 actually who explicitly characterized themselves as eco-socialist. I was one, and the other was Miriam Haddad, who's an immigration lawyer, a Syrian immigrant here in Montreal. And she was unabashedly eco-socialist and had a very refreshing, outspoken defense of the values and programs and policies that are cherished by eco-socialists in this country. And then there was another candidate, Amita Kutner from BC, who I think it's fair to say was quite progressive in her orientation, but I don't recall her ever having, even on one occasion, explicitly characterized herself as a socialist or eco-socialist. But generally, people kind of lump the 3 of us together, and that's fine. Amita certainly, as I said, they have a very progressive agenda, but the others wouldn't touch, the term eco-socialism with a 10-foot pole. And in fact, I was, constantly being told, Dimitri, I mean, if we use that word, we're going to lose so much support. And I'm like, well, first of all, we got 3 seats in Parliament, man. We have less than 1% of the seats in Parliament. So, and this is the best result we've ever had, Mike. In 2019, when we won 3 seats, was the best result the party has ever had, and it was formed back in the 1980s. So it's not like, our program has been resonating with Canadians, like gangbusters over the past 10 to 20 years. So why don't we try something new? And in fact, polls support that something new. An explicitly socialist agenda appeals to a lot of Canadians. Last year in the 2019 election, Forum Research did a poll asking Canadians how they felt about socialism, and 58% said they have a positive view of socialism. In the Green Party, the number was 69%, and a majority had a negative view of capitalism as well. In the NDP, of course, same thing. Huge majority had a positive view of socialism and a negative view of capitalism. And even in the Liberal Party, something in the range of, I think it was slightly in excess of 70% of Liberal Party supporters had a positive view of socialism. I believe it was somewhere in the range of 45%, slightly less than a majority had a negative view of capitalism. So, I can repeatedly made the argument that we need to get beyond this idea that characterizing oneself as a socialist or democratic socialist is the kiss of death. It is an idea whose time has come. People are hungry for it. We're seeing that not just here in Canada. We saw that with the rise of Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom. We saw that with the Bernie Sanders movement, with democratic socialists in Congress, in city councils around major cities in the United States like Seattle and Chicago. Socialism is an idea whose time has come, and we should have the courage to be the champions of socialism. It is the only way forward. It's socialism or barbarism. That's the choice confronting us. Socialism or annihilation. It's as simple as that.
I do remember that poll that you were referring to, and I remember it really struck me as amazing just how much support there was for anti-capitalist ideas, given that there's not a single major federal party, there's not a single party in Parliament that's actually consciously and openly advocating for socialism. They all treat it like it's some kind of dirty word, like this hangover from the Cold War, when in fact, poll after poll shows that the majority of the population is looking for socialist ideas. They're looking for precisely this. And it seems to me that it was exactly in this atmosphere, as capitalism is failing and falling apart, not just on the climate front, but even in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis and everything that came since. It just boggles the mind that in that atmosphere, the NDP decided to remove socialism from their constitution.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that your campaign demonstrates that the NDP needs to worry about its left flank.
Oh yeah, they better be worried. They're going to have, if the NDP doesn't get, get religion on socialism real fast, the party is doomed. The party is doomed. It cannot survive in the long run. I mean, it's been, people are saying, oh, look at, Jagmeet Singh, a few points went up here and people are starting to like him and so forth. The bottom line is that the NDP got creamed in the last election. They got absolutely creamed. It started with Tom Mulcair, tacking to the right even of Justin Trudeau, who, by the way, is no centrist. And I think you know this, Mike. Trudeau's no centrist. Trudeau is right wing. And he only looks like a centrist because the Conservatives have gone off the deep end of right wing ideology. They're on the fringes of the right wing. And so they make Trudeau look progressive. But in fact, Trudeau is on the right, and Tom Mulcair seemed determined to outflank Trudeau on the right. And what happened? The NDP suffered a massive loss, and it's never recovered. And Jagmeet Singh is nowhere near to returning them, to being in a viable position of taking power. And unless Jagmeet Singh and the leaders, the other leadership persons within the leadership of the NDP understand the inherent appeal of socialism to Canadians, and that it is the only way forward for a democratic and sustainable society and economy, eventually the NDP will disappear into irrelevance. And I think that that's absolutely true of the Green Party as well. Those parties who we need a voice on the left, and it's outrageous. It's outrageous that 58% of Canadians have a positive view of socialism and not one party in Parliament is explicitly socialist. It only confirms what I said, a few minutes ago. The people who are calling the shots in this country are the billionaire class. That's why we can't get a wealth tax in Parliament. That's why we can't get, a substantial increase in the top marginal tax rate. That's why we can't, slash military spending, which is out of control in this country. That's why we don't have pharma care. That's why, post-secondary education is becoming prohibitively expensive. Has become prohibitively expensive for so many students around this country. It's because the ultra wealthy are calling the shots. We do not have a democracy, and we won't have a democracy until we have socialists in Parliament in large numbers.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that point. But for people that are just tuning in, and are kind of new to politics, do you want to explain to them what exactly is eco-socialism? What's this all about?
Well, a socialist, eco-socialist whom I respect immensely, said, at the outset of my campaign, I had a conversation with him. How would you define eco-socialism? He says, look, Dimitri, nobody has a patent on eco-socialism. It means different things for different people. For me, I reduce it to a set of 5 or 6 core principles, within which there's, significant room for reasonable disagreement. So the one is absolutely no poverty. The existence of poverty and homelessness is inexcusable and intolerable, and no decent, democratic, humane society would allow, especially one as wealthy as Canada's, would allow any poverty to exist. Number 2, no extreme wealth. So nobody should be permitted to have so much wealth that they are able to bend democratic institutions to their will and corrupt the political class, which happened long ago in this country. Number 3, the essential industries, the industries that are fundamentally important to the well-being, the happiness, and the security of Canadians should be under democratic control. So I'm okay with some degree of private enterprise, and I don't think we have to have, absolute material equality. I'm okay with some significant discrepancies in wealth and income, but we have to narrow the range of inequality enormously, profoundly, in order to have a democratic and eco-socialist society. Number 4, we have to have an economy that is completely sustainable, profoundly respectful of Mother Earth. And number 5, we have to be committed in every fiber of our being to peace. No militarism, no war, violence, no tolerance for violence whatsoever, no tolerance for physically violent and psychologically violent forms of interaction, racism, things of that nature. So peace, equality, sustainability, humanity, no poverty, no extreme wealth, and sustainability, of course. Those are the basic elements of an eco-socialist society and economy. And within that, you can be very creative. There's room for legitimate disagreement about how exactly we should structure our economy. But those elements are indispensable. And I would fight for them tooth and nail. And I happen to believe that if you define eco-socialism in those terms, you will find that a vast majority of the Canadian public will support eco-socialism.
So I'm glad that you raised the point of militarism and imperialism, because I think it's fairly obvious when you just look at the amount of infrastructure involved in the military-industrial complex, not just in the United States but globally. A huge portion of humanity's collective carbon emissions come from war and come from tools of war. But nobody seems to talk about this. And in fact, it's incredibly difficult to find statistics about what the military carbon footprint actually is. If you go Google and look around, you're going to have a hard time actually quantifying that, even though you can guarantee the people in positions of authority, they can quantify that. They know what their operations are. But it seems to me that the greatest thing that we could do to reduce our carbon emissions overnight is to simply park every single military vehicle and walk away from them. And it's mind-boggling that this idea of saving the climate through waging peace is not even on the political agenda. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, I want to just point out, Mike, it is true that historically there has been precious little information about the carbon footprint of militaries in general, and especially Canada's military. But the Canadian government days ago issued an analysis of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions by the federal government. And I'm sure this won't surprise you. I won't surprise many, if any, of the people listening to us this evening. By far, the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the federal government was the Department of Defense, the so-called Department of Defense. They really should call it the Department of War. And the next largest source of greenhouse gas emissions, the second one, was, I think, less than a third of the greenhouse gas emissions of the Department of National Defense. And of course, the larger the military, the greater its carbon footprint. So Canada's, relative to that of the United States, is tiny, the military. The United States spends, I think more than twice on its military than Russia and China combined. And even if your singular concern is resolving the climate emergency, even if you're not particularly concerned about things like imperialism, you should be. If you care about human rights, if you care about equality, if you care about humanity, you should be very concerned about militarism and imperialism. But if the only thing you care about is resolution of the climate emergency, you should be anti-militarist. You should be calling for the demilitarization of our country and every other country on this planet. And it's not just the carbon footprint of the militaries. The militaries create tension, they create war, they create conflict. That's exactly what they're designed to do. And the climate emergency is something that requires an unprecedented level of international cooperation and solidarity. We can't come together as a species and resolve this existential threat without working with each other in a cooperative and peaceful manner. And the militaries of our various countries are getting in the way. That's not consistent with their goal. They exist to create conflict, to perpetuate conflict. They profit from conflict. So, this is actually something, and I talked about this a lot during the leadership campaign. In its origins, the Green Party movement, and Petra Kelly, one of the great founders of the German Green Party, She was fundamentally anti-militarist. This may have been the thing that motivated her the most. Her condemnations of NATO were relentless. The call for the denuclearization of Europe, relentless. And that's what the Green Party was born to be. It was born to be a champion of peace and demilitarization. And somewhere along the way, I have to be candid with you, I mentioned there were 3 things that are wrong with our party today. That's one of them. We lost our way. We forgot what it was that motivated the creation of this party in the first place. It wasn't just the environment. It was peace and demilitarization.
Now, you've been an outspoken advocate for Palestinian rights and against the apartheid system that we have in Israel-Palestine right now. I know that's been a major political football in the Green Party. There recent conventions, there have been floor fights around this issue. I know Elizabeth Bay, he wasn't shy about saying that she disagreed with the position that her party agreed with at their convention and wasn't carrying it forward. I know in past you've been denounced for your support of Palestinians. They called you a terrorist and everything like that. I've been called a terrorist for the same thing. How did that play out in this race? I do think that support for the Palestinian people against the Israeli occupation has got to be unequivocal for anyone that's putting forward a progressive view of the world. It's not allowed in our political system, but you've carried that torch anyways. How did that play out in this race?
Well, yeah, I quote the words of Dr. Tariq Loubani, a Canadian-Palestinian doctor who in 2018 was shot by an Israeli sniper while he was in the field tending or trying to tend to wounded Palestinian civilians in the Great March of Return. When he said at an event back in 2017 to raise funds for Nikki Ashton's leadership campaign in the NDP was that Palestine is a litmus test for politicians. And I couldn't agree more. It is a true measure of the integrity, the moral integrity and the moral courage of a politician. If you can't be counted upon to stand up for a people who, as you said, Mike, and I admire your candor in this regard, it's so refreshing to hear somebody say this in this country, with people listening in on a conversation, that it's an apartheid state. If you cannot muster the courage and the moral integrity to denounce an apartheid state and defend its victims, you have no business holding public office in this country. I mean, just imagine if somebody today who was a vigorous defender and cheerleader for South Africa's apartheid regime ran for political office, and you said to that person, how do you feel today about your support for South African apartheid, for the Afrikaner regime? And the person said, well, actually, I make no apologies for it. I think it was a fine regime. We have shared values with them, and I was very happy to promote deeper trade benefits and to vote, in favor of that regime at the United Nations and so forth. That person would be politically dead in the water today. No party would touch that radioactive candidate with a 10-foot pole. Well, why is it okay, given that reality, and we all know that that's the reality, why is it okay for people who support Israeli apartheid to be holding political office in this country? And 90% of the politicians, if you at least publicly in Parliament, that's exactly what they do. They enthusiastically cheerlead for Israel, which is clearly an apartheid state. So, I haven't answered your question. I'll try to, be as brief as possible. The question came up again and again in the leadership contest, and I treated the question exactly as I treated it back from 2016 when, we succeeded in getting a BDS resolution passed over the objections of our leader. And that is that I'm going to be true to human rights. I believe in the universality of human rights. And if I have to throw the Palestinian people under the bus in order to hold political office in this country, I have absolutely zero interest in holding political office in this country. And nor would I be fit to hold political office in this country if I was prepared to throw victims of apartheid under the bus in order to advance my own political ambitions. And that's the way we should think about this question. That's the way we should think about this question. And the last thing I want to say about that is Elizabeth May, she went to the West Bank in 2018, 2 years after we had that battle within the Green Party. And and she went at the invitation not of Israeli government officials, she went at the invitation of Palestinians. And when she returned, she sat at a press conference in Ottawa with Alexandre Bouleris from the NDP and a Bloc MP, and she said, and you can see this to this very day on YouTube, that what is being done to Palestinians in occupied territory is much worse than apartheid in South Africa. Once she saw it with her own eyes, she could no longer deny what those of us who have been there, as I have been 4 times, know to be true, because it's inescapable, and that is the Palestinian people are being subjected to a brutal, murderous form of apartheid.
Yeah, I mean, people raise all kinds of objections about that word, but I mean, it fits the definition. I'm sorry, but there are separate rules and separate laws for people based on their ethnicity. You have roads that can only be used by Jewish people and not by Palestinian people, and all kinds of infrastructure is problems people are facing this way. There's really no other way to describe it than an apartheid system.
Now, Mike, I'm sorry, I just got to say, all you need to know, I mean, there's so much more. You mentioned some of the features of this apartheid system. The fact that people of Palestinian origin, whose ancestors lived for centuries in what is now Israel, that they, living outside of the country, cannot return, that they're deprived of the right of the return, while people who are of Jewish origin and who've never lived in Israel, whose mother and father never lived in Israel, who were not born in Israel, they have the right to go and live in Israel, but persons of Palestinian origin who have deep, centuries-long connections to Israel cannot go because of their ethnicity. How does that not constitute apartheid? Just the law of return alone.
Well, certainly the right of return of refugees from a war-torn area is a universal human right. This is recognized by international law. You can't deny civilians from returning to their homes when the shooting stops. Yet, Israel's able to continue these sorts of policies with impunity, and in fact, returning Palestinian refugees are not even on the table for discussion. Yeah, and it's not even allowed for discussion in the political systems that we have. Now, I have every sympathy and absolute solidarity for Jewish people that have the right to live in peace. Now, it seems that you can't actually raise this issue without being labeled as a terrorist sympathizer or whatever. But I have to say, I really admire the way that you've taken this issue on, even when it's difficult, because it is a litmus test. You can't stand by and watch atrocities being done and not say anything about it for political convenience. And I think that's something that's dominating our political landscape right now.
Yeah. And what you said, Mike, I think you very much were alluding to this. It is ultimately a legal question. The question of apartheid there's a definition in international law. There has been for decades. And ultimately, whether Israel is committing the crime of apartheid comes down to a legal analysis based upon legal principles and the facts. And, Professor Richard Falk, amongst others, one of the world's leading international jurists, a couple of years ago, authored a detailed analysis of the legal question and concluded, and these were his words, that the evidence that Israel is committing the crime of apartheid within the meaning of international law is overwhelming. Overwhelming. So those of our Canadian politicians who continue to defend Israel and to demonize those who criticize it for its human rights violations and who ask that it be held accountable, I think they should look in the mirror, they should search their conscience and ask themselves whether they're truly committed to human rights.
Now, obviously, there are a lot more issues on the international stage than Israel-Palestine. But you said you'd like to see the Green Party taking more of an anti-imperialist approach to their international positions. What else does that look like?
Oh God, there's so much. I mean, we should get the hell out of the Lima Group fast. The Lima Group, which is ostensibly was ostensibly established. It's like I can hardly say this without laughing, Mike. You know, to promote democracy and human rights in Venezuela. I mean, first of all, the idea that Juan Guaido, the charlatan who's held up by the Canadian government and other members of the Lido Group as the president of Venezuela, I mean, it's comical. I'm quite familiar with the constitutional provision that's being invoked to as the basis of he's the legitimate president, and it does not in any way, shape, or form support the argument that he's a legitimate president. The elections which saw Maduro return to power, international observers opined that they were free and fair elections. There is no basis to say that the Venezuelan people did not elect Maduro. I don't think Maduro is perfect. I think he has flaws. I much prefer, to be candid with you, Hugo Chavez. I have a great deal of respect for Mr. Chavez and what he accomplished as leader of Venezuela. I wish he were the president of Venezuela today. But Maduro is, despite his flaws, better than the right-wing lunatics you see who have come to power in countries like Brazil, and, for example, the dictator of Honduras, and the far-right regime in Colombia, which is the deadliest country on earth for land defenders. All the countries that I mentioned are part of the Lima Group. You know, I mean, who are we kidding? We're in bed with Bolsonaro, the dictator of Honduras, who brazenly stole the election there a few years ago, with Colombia, the far-right regime of Colombia, and we claim to be, concerned or motivated by a desire to defend the human rights of Venezuelans. So there's one area, a regime change agenda in Iran, and the sanctions that have been imposed upon Iran. They're having a devastating impact on the Iranian people, absolute devastating impact. And we have no memory about how that current regime, which is a severe human rights violator, how it came to power. How did it come to power? It came to power because in 1950, the CIA and British intelligence, and this has been admitted by the CIA, this is not a conspiracy theory, they admitted it. They engineered the overthrow, a coup d'etat which removed from power Mohammad Mossadegh, a democratically elected president. And what was his crime? Why did they do that? Because he wanted to nationalize the Anglo-American oil company for the benefit of his people. This is a matter of historical record. Who replaced him? The Shah of Iran, a vicious, brutal tyrant. And ultimately that led to this revolution which installed in power, or which saw this Islamic fundamentalist regime come to power. That's how we got here. So we need to be mindful of the ways in which our government and our so-called allies have undermined democratic regimes around the world. The way we're dealing with China, and the way we're dealing with Russia. I mean, whatever their flaws, and by all means, I don't deny for 1 second the governments of China and Russia have committed severe human rights violations and continue to do so. But they have not caused anywhere near the suffering to innocent civilians that the United States government has caused. You look at the way the United States laid waste to Vietnam, to Cambodia, to Laos, to Iraq, to Libya, the genocidal regimes it supported in Guatemala, the genocidal attacks on Yemen that it's supporting through its proxy, Saudi Arabia. Our closest ally has been more violative of human rights than any of the official enemies of the United States have ever been in the post-World War II period. And yet we are in bed with the United States. We regard the United States as our closest ally, and our foreign policy is basically a pale imitation of U.S. foreign policy. So, our foreign policy in every respect almost every respect is imperialist and is militaristic. We just aren't as bad as the U.S., and so that allows us to convince ourselves that we're a peaceful, humane, law-abiding country on the international stage. But, the international community knows better. That's why, for the second time in a row, we lost our bid a few months ago for a seat on the United Nations Security Council, because our credibility has now been shredded.
It's funny you should mention that we compare ourselves to the United States, because I find that in general, we only compare ourselves to the United States, and then as the Canadian identity very much is wrapped up in this idea of comparing ourselves to our neighbors to the south and being slightly better to them, and we tend to think of ourselves as this great progressive country that does all kinds of wonderful things. But when you actually compare to other industrialized nations where Canada's at, you'll find that for the most part they pretty much all have better health care, better workers' rights, more vacation time, and everything else under the sun. And actually, we really only look better in comparison to the United States. We don't look better for in terms of livability of the country when compared to other major European powers, for example, or other G8 countries.
Absolutely, Mike,
I
100%.
I think Michael Moore made a whole documentary trying to underline that point. But if we're going to get anywhere as a society, we need to raise our expectations about what's possible. Because, uh, I mean, the right to strike is another one that gets me again and again. And not just about being legislated back to work. I certainly have that history. You know that every time you actually exercise your right to strike in this country, the government steps in and takes it away when you try to use it. But that point aside, even, most industrialized nations have far better rights for workers to walk off the job when they're not happy with their situation than Canada does. In most countries, you have the right to walk off the job over matters not covered by a collective agreement. In most countries, you have the right. Even in the United States, they have concerted action protections. Non-union workers are allowed to take strike action, and that's protected. They can't be punished for it. You've got nothing like that in this country. We're far, far behind in workers' rights, um,
100%.
and many other things.
When it comes to protecting the unemployed, protecting the disabled, protection of the environment, when it comes to the distribution of wealth, we only look good because we compare ourselves to the United States government. And frankly, Mike, that's a big part of the reason why I spend so much time trying to shine a light on the horrific flaws of American society, not just its foreign policy, but its domestic policies, which are also atrocious. So that when we think about what is the country that we should emulate, that we should compare ourselves to in order to assess how well we're doing as a society, it should not be the United States. That's the last government to which we should be comparing ourselves. It is an extremist country that is in rapid decline. We're watching. I mean, it's horrifying to watch. But the United States is an empire in rapid decay. And we have to prepare ourselves for the eventuality, because this is what's coming: a complete and utter collapse of American society, economy, and the shreds of the democracy that remain. I mean, today the United States broke the record. It broke the record for the most deaths during the pandemic, in excess of 3,000 deaths. I think it smashed the prior record for one-day deaths, and it's going to get worse. This country is in a shambles. And I hope, that if anything good comes out of this pandemic, that at least one of the things will be that we as a country will understand just how broken American society is, just how unjust it is, how incompetent its government, how corrupt its government is at every level, and that we stop comparing ourselves to the United States of America and set our standards higher.
Yeah, and I think this pandemic has really revealed a lot of problems that we're facing, and I think 30 years of neoliberalism, of trying to cut everything down to the bone, of making sure that there's no excess capacity in any system, and everything's just running by the skin of its teeth. Like, that whole outlook is now coming crashing down, and the chickens are coming home to roost. I mean, these decisions that we as a society have made over the last 30 years are now coming to really screw us, because we're finding that as we hit a major pandemic, we don't actually have the spaces in the hospitals to account for the surge. We don't actually have the income supports in place that people need to get through this sort of thing. So
Hmm.
I do think that, this crisis that we're going through now is going to have long-term repercussions that we really can't even wrap our heads around yet. And I think it's I would hope that this whole neoliberal economic model of cutting everything to the bone and maximizing profitability uh, will be a thing of the past after this.
Yeah, it's. I think we've done a terrible job, frankly, and I'm not playing politics. I mean, I just think we've done a terrible job of dealing with the pandemic, and our failure to deal with it effectively. Uh, you know, it began many years ago. There's been a lot of discussion recently, for example, about the fact that we once had a world-class pharmaceutical manufacturer, Connaught Labs, which was sold off by the Mulroney government. And Trudeau, when he was forced to admit that we have to rely upon foreign sources to manufacture in sufficient quantities effective and safe COVID-19 vaccine, he pointed to the fact that it was a conservative government that sold off Connaught Labs. Well, how many years did the Liberals rule after Mulroney was displaced from power? Why didn't the Chrétien government deal with this? Why didn't the Paul Martin government rebuild our capacity to manufacture domestically vitally important vaccines and other pharmaceutical products? And for that matter, why didn't Trudeau do anything about this during his first term in office? So we would be in a much better position, and this is just one respect in which we are failing to deal with the pandemic effectively, but we would be in a much better position to deliver on a timely basis effective and safe vaccines to our population if first of all, if Connaught Labs had never been sold off to begin with, but even taking it as a given that happened, if the many liberal and conservative governments that succeeded Brian Mulroney's government had actually dealt with the problem and rectified his mistake. So we really, at the end of the day, there's going to be an accounting. There has to be an accounting for what went wrong in the pandemic. Now we're just trying to get through it. And Mike, I got to tell you, I think that this is, the idea that there's going to be a vaccine that's going to come on in 2 months' time and we're going to be, more or less back to normal in the spring. I think that's a fantasy. It's going to take us years to recover from this. I think I would be surprised if we've gotten the pandemic under control, really under control by the end of 2021. And I would love to be wrong, but I think when you look at you look at how long it normally takes in order to develop a safe and effective vaccine, how much time it's going to take to manufacture the necessary number of doses, distribute them, and convince an already skeptical population to take the vaccine in sufficient numbers. This is not something that we're going to get under control in the next few months. And afterwards, it'll be very interesting once we do get it under control, and eventually we will. It'll be very interesting to see how the attitudes of our citizens have changed towards persons in position of power. This could be, let us hope, that it is a defining moment in public consciousness about the true state of our economy, about the true structure of power in our society and the way it's being deployed for the benefit of the few and to the detriment of the many.
Yeah, I mean, as I see the vaccine rollout, one I was very happy to see effective vaccines passing clinical trials. I think medical science is on the side of these things right now. It looks like a number of effective vaccines are in production. I was initially excited. I thought that we were going to be able to knock this thing down before the end of cold and flu season. Doesn't look like that's going to happen. I think we'll be able to get most vulnerable people vaccinated before the end of cold and flu season, and have most of the country vaccinated before the next one. But that's assuming there's no problems with the rollout that they've laid out now. But I think you're absolutely right that the impacts of this pandemic are going to affect us for years and years to come. We're going to see all kinds of well, I it's difficult to see how we don't have a period of harsh austerity and sovereign debt crises on a global scale coming out of this. I mean, remember at the end of the day, we live in a capitalist world under a capitalist system, and this system is not exactly built to handle these sorts of global crises, at least not without putting the burden onto working people. I do think that the pandemic spending that we've seen to try and get us through this, they are going to come back and try and make the working class pay for all of this.
Oh, yes, they will.
You know, doesn't matter that Jeff Bezos has made tens of billions of dollars this year off of off the pandemic economy. They're not going to take that money from him.
Or the 10 richest Canadians who saw their collective net worth increase by 13 billion during the pandemic. They're not taking their money off of those guys either. So, this will fall. You're absolutely right, Mike. It's going to fall unless we stop it from happening. The burden will fall on working Canadians and the poor, the unemployed.
And I think it's really incumbent on the labor movement to get their act together and realize that major attacks are on the horizon and that we've got to prepare for this fight. We've got to make sure that working people can't be forced to pay for this crisis. If you look back even to World War II, when you had massive tax rates on not just individuals but corporations and companies and so on, there simply doesn't seem to be any appetite for such things now. It's like that's off limits to even discuss. It doesn't matter that these people, the billionaires of the world, have been able to grow their wealth tremendously and make tens of billions of dollars in profit precisely off pandemic sales and pandemic actions. What does it say about capitalism? We don't as an economic system, as a society, we don't seem to be capable of holding to the elites to the standards that we could half a century ago.
Yes. Oh, how the people have fallen. I couldn't agree more.
Is this simply empire in decline? Is this a normal part of civilizations that are falling apart, or is there?
Well, I think,
or does it hearken a change to something better?
Oh,
give me a reason to be optimistic here, Dimitri.
Well, change is a coming, Mike. I tell you, the people will not tolerate this for much longer. I think we are going to experience, if the pandemic doesn't do it, it'll happen in short order after the pandemic. Because once we emerge from the pandemic, you're exactly right. What is going to happen is that the oligarchy and their corrupt pawns in the political class are going to try to foist the burden onto working people, onto the poor, onto the most vulnerable members of society. People are now, and people will remember, because we've kind of forgotten in the pandemic, that we are confronted by a far greater threat. It's unfolding before our very eyes, and that's the climate emergency. And eventually people will rise up. They will rise up and they will bring down this corrupt system of oppression, this inhumane, voracious, rapacious capitalist system that is destroying the planet and eviscerating the future of our children and our grandchildren. They will rise up. And for me, the question is not if. The question is when. When is that going to happen? Will it happen soon enough? I think it will. But one of the main reasons why it doesn't give me really any pleasure at all to say the things that I feel obliged as a matter of conscience to say and then be subjected to attacks for them. I do it because I'm keenly conscious of the fact, I'm sure you have exactly the same feeling, Mike, that if we don't rise up soon enough, it'll be too late. I think we still have time, but it isn't much. We can't wait until the 11th hour, until we're on the precipice of extinction, to rise up against this morally bankrupt and destructive system and those who are the guardians of the system. We have to do it as quickly as possible. And I do think it's going to happen. And, I'm out there, and I know you are too, out there every day urging our fellow citizens to say no more. And it doesn't take 50% of the population rising up. I mean, they're even 3, 4, 5% of the population saying we're not going to take it anymore. We're going to grind the economy to a halt. We're going to call for general strikes. We're going to close down, major pieces of infrastructure. Like you started to see some of this in the Wet'suwet'en solidarity actions around the country, which really only, paused because of the pandemic. It has begun. You've seen this with Black Lives Matter, and Black Lives Matter is not just about racism against Black people. It certainly was the primary motivation for the creation of that wonderful movement. But there are many people supporting the Black Lives Matter movement who see larger questions at play, a more profound form of oppression and injustice, and understand that racism is baked into the capitalist system. And they've said, we've had enough. So I do believe the time is coming, and let us hope that it comes sooner rather than later, because time is short.
Well, that being said, I suppose we should wrap this thing up sooner or later, but what's on the agenda for the eco-socialists and the Green Party? You mentioned there's a convention coming up on the horizon. What's next?
Well, we've put forward, I say we, people who were very heavily involved in the campaign. People privileged to call them friends and to have had their support. They've remained fully engaged, and together we came forward with 14 resolutions, which are essentially drawn from the eco-socialist platform that we put forward. We've submitted those resolutions. We got the requisite number of sponsors. And now our singular objective over the months ahead will be to persuade our fellow Greens to adopt these resolutions and make them part of party policy. And if we can do that, if we can just, we aren't trying to implement the entire platform, of course. We're focusing on, some really important things like demilitarization, taxes on the wealthy, withdrawal from NATO, which is very important to us. A postal savings bank, Bank of Canada, and its financing of government, of socially productive initiatives by the government. So we've taken a core number of policies. We're going to advance them. We're going to engage in a robust dialogue with our fellow Greens, and hopefully they'll become part of the party's platform in the next election. I think if we can do that, we will have accomplished a great deal.
And just one final question. If people want to get involved with this initiative, if they want to find out more, if they want to fight for these things, what do they do?
Well, we're going to be setting up, pretty sure we're going to be setting up some kind of a platform. It's just a question that we actually had a meeting tonight to discuss the next steps. We may be setting up a website. We may be setting up some other platform that will enable people to see the resolutions, to learn how they can help advance those resolutions, and to engage with us in a discussion about why we've brought these policies forward. And people will be free to comment on ways in which we can improve them. So for the time being, I would say, stay in touch with me. I have a personal website, DimitriLascaris.org, which I'm in the process of revamping, but it continues to be live, and I'll be announcing on my website in the weeks ahead exactly how we propose to engage party members with these 14 resolutions that we put forward. So for the time being, I think I recommend people go to my website and just watch there for news about the policy process.
Well, great. Thanks a lot for joining us this week, Dimitri, and for everything that you're doing to push this forward. stay tuned. Follow this struggle. Keep your eyes open for the eco-socialist and the Green Party. I have a feeling we haven't heard the end of them yet.
Thank you very much for having me on, Mike. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, comrade. We'll talk to you again.
Take care, brother.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You too. So, thanks for joining us this week on Live Mike with Mike Palasek. Tune in next week when we're going to have a legendary organizer from the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. John Clark will be joining us next Thursday to talk about struggles and history. We'll see you then.